Good day, everyone. This is Chris back again with the Ancient Scholar. Today we're going to be talking about genetic disorders, part 2. So I was just getting into talking about autosomal recessive and autosomal dominant disorders. I kind of cut it off early, and we'll start anew with this video. So we know what DNA is in general sense, and we know that sections of DNA that code for specific traits, characteristics, or even problems are known as genes. And we know that DNA and genes and all that are kind of wrapped up and compacted and condensed into larger structures known as chromosomes. And we know that there are 23 pair chromosomes for a total of 46, half from mom, half from dad. The X and the Y pair are responsible for the sexual sex characteristics, rather, be it male or female. Those are called the sex chromosomes, and diseases that originate from those are known as sex-linked disorders. And we're actually going to be talking about the autosomes, which are all the other chromosomes, chromosomes other than the X and the Y chromosomes, so pairs. So autosomal recessive obviously involves an autosome, and what recessive is recessive. It's a pattern of inheritance rather, because these genetic disorders are inherited. And basically what it is if we have a pair of chromosomes, and one of the chromosomes has a gene in it that codes for genetic disease. As long as only one of the chromosomes has it, the other one can kind of take over, and the patient will not exhibit that disease. However, if both chromosomes have the gene that codes for that disorder, that disease, illness, then the patient will end up getting that disease. So it's what we call a recessive trait, because as long as I have a good chromosome that's unaffected, the patient will not develop that disease. It takes that trait has to exist in both chromosomes for that patient to exhibit the disease. That's known as an autosomal recessive disorder. Autosomal dominant disorder, however, is a little different. If you have a gene that codes for a certain disorder, if you have it anywhere in one of the two chromosomes, you're going to get that disease. You will have manifestations of that disease. So the autosomal recessive is sort of like a backup. As long as I got one good chromosome in that pair, I'm okay. With autosomal dominant, is if I have a gene that codes for an autosomal dominant disease, I'm going to get that disease. It doesn't matter if I have another chromosome that's in good shape. If that gene exists in one of the chromosomes, I'll have the disease. So we call that a dominant trait. So that's just a difference between autosomal recessive and autosomal dominant. Okay, so there are lots of different disorders that can be recessive or dominant. A couple of the disorders that are one of the major disorders you'll run across is something called cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is in a category of disorders known as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. The COPD is a statement that defines several different diseases, and you may hear the term C-babe. C-babe. And C-babe is is kind of a mnemonic that we can use to help identify all the diseases which are obstructive. So, C stands for cystic fibrosis, B stands for chronic bronchitis, A stands for asthma, B stands for bronchiectasis, and E stands for emphysema. So those are the 5 cardinal disorders in the obstructive diseases category. And we'll talk about obstructive diseases a little later on in the pathophysiology course. And you guys have probably already touched on them in your first semester respiratory coursework. Well, cystic fibrosis is one of those diseases, and it's characterized by excessive amounts of mucus, mucus plugging in the airways, ineffective mechanisms to get rid of the mucus. You also have issues with digestion. The pancreas often does not function properly in patients with cystic fibrosis. They don't produce pancreatic enzymes, and of course pancreatic enzymes are secreted by the pancreas and ultimately secreted into the digestive tract to help us digest things such as proteins. So often the patients with cystic fibrosis require very aggressive therapy, mucus clearing therapy. We talk about chest physiotherapy, you talk about postural drainage, you talk about mucolytic medications. Obviously, nebulized bronchodilator medications is going to be a part of this. These patients obviously are going to be at high risk for infections, and there are some antimicrobial agents that we can talk about as well, in addition to requiring supplementation of pancreatic enzymes. Okay, and that's actually an autosomal recessive disorder, cystic fibrosis. There are some autosomal dominant disorders. I'm not really going to cover them. Not a disorder, but a trait, interestingly enough, is the presence of freckles. If you have a freckle, it's an autosomal dominant trait. So that's really the meat of the difference between autosomal recessive and dominant, be able to compare and contrast those and be able to recognize what they're talking about if you happen to come across a disease that is recessive versus dominant. Now, there are many other types of conditions and diseases that are genetically linked. Cancer, we know, has a genetic link. Asthma, another one of those obstructive disorders, a big genetic link. Allergies, big genetic link. Now, when we talk about somebody who is at risk for a disease, there are different factors that factor into their risk for developing a disease. The first group of factors are what we call modifiable factors, and the second group are non-modifiable. Now, modifiable factors would be something like smoking, toxin exposure to pollution. These, of course, are associated with cancer, and they're associated with COPD. However, if I can quit smoking, improve my lifestyle, I can modify those risks, or these are called modifiable risks, and I can decrease my chances of developing cancer and COPD. However, if I have a genetic anomaly, abnormality, such as the alpha-A1 antitrypsin deficiency, that is a non-modifiable factor. There's not much I can do about genetics right now. Perhaps sometime in the future, when gene therapy and stem cell therapies become sufficiently advanced and effective, we may be able to modify our genetic makeup. Perhaps. Certainly not the reality now. So genetics are generally considered non-modifiable risk factors for developing a disease, whereas all the other lifestyle, exposure, so on and so forth, are what we call modifiable risk factors. Okay, guys, I'm going to go ahead and cut it off here. And you've just made it through the introduction to genetics and genetic disorders. Take care.